There's a unique kind of silence that falls over an open-plan office during a company-weighty town hall. It's not empty. It's a silence filled with the low hum of computer towers, the faint rhythmic clicking of a distant keyboard, and the collective, focused attention of dozens of people staring at their screens. On that particular Tuesday afternoon, the silence felt heavy, suffocating. I sat at my desk, a forgotten mug of cold coffee beside me, my world shrinking to the 16-inch monitor in front of me. On it, a live stream was playing from the main executive conference room on the 40th floor, a world away from my cubicle on the 15th. And in the center of that world, under the warm professional glow of the recessed lighting, stood my boss, Mark. He was in his element. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he commanded the room with an easy confidence, his voice smooth and reassuring as it came through my headphones. He gestured towards the large screen behind him, where my slide deck was displayed. The title of the presentation was Project Nightingale, and seeing it there next to his smiling face felt like a physical blow. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I focused on keeping my breathing even, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel, even though he wasn't there to see it. It was a matter of pride, a small, futile act of defiance in the face of absolute betrayal. Project Nightingale wasn't just an assignment. For 6 months, it had been my entire professional life. It was a comprehensive market analysis and strategy proposal designed to pivot our company into a new, untapped sector. I had conceived of it, pitched the initial concept, and then poured every ounce of my creativity and analytical skill into it. There were weeks I had worked until midnight, fueled by lukewarm takeout and the exhilarating thrill of creating something truly impactful. I had built the predictive models, designed the data visualizations, and written every single word of the 90-page report that the presentation was based on. It was my magnum opus, the kind of career-defining work that gets you noticed, that takes you to the next level. It was, in short, my baby. And now, I was watching a stranger claim paternity. Mark clicked to the next slide, a complex flowchart illustrating the multi-phase rollout I had meticulously planned. He began to speak, and the words that came out of his mouth were my own. Not just the data points and the professional jargon, but the specific turns of phrase, the analogies I had thought up late at night to make the complex data more digestible. He was performing my work, and the executives in the room were captivated. I could see our CEO, a formidable man named Mr. Abernathy, nodding in approval, a rare smile on his face. He was buying every word of it. The chat window on the side of the live stream was a waterfall of praise. "Incredible vision, Mark," one message read. "This is game-changing," said another. Each comment was a small, sharp sting. They were cheering for a phantom, a thief who had cloaked himself in my intellectual property. The bitter irony was that Mark barely understood the deeper mechanics of the model he was so confidently presenting. I knew this because I had tried to walk him through it twice, only to be met with a dismissive wave and a comment about him being a big-picture guy. He hadn't just stolen the credit. He had erased me from the narrative entirely. My contribution was not minimized, it was non-existent. As he moved towards his concluding remarks, a summary of the projected revenue growth and market capture numbers I had agonized over for weeks, a profound and chilling realization washed over me. This wasn't just about a single project. This was about my future. If he could do this so brazenly, so completely, then my career at this company was over. I would be forever relegated to the role of a faceless drone, a resource to be plundered for the benefit of my manager. He had not just stolen my work, he had stolen my voice. And as I watched him take a bow to the sound of applause from the conference room, I knew that if I didn't find a way to get it back, I would have nothing left. To understand how a person can watch their entire professional achievement be stolen in real time without storming into the room and shouting the truth, you have to understand the person I was before that moment. As the live stream ended and the screen defaulted back to the company logo, a single, burning question echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. How did I let it get this far? The answer, I'm ashamed to admit, was my own deeply held and deeply flawed belief in meritocracy. I had spent my entire career convinced that good, honest work was its own reward, that the truth of effort would always shine through the noise of office politics. I saw myself as a craftsperson, not a courtier. My domain was data, and I loved it. I found narratives in spreadsheets and poetry in statistics. For the past 2 years as a senior analyst, my philosophy was simple. Keep your head down, deliver exceptional results, and your work will speak for itself. It was a noble idea, but in the corporate world, it was also a stunningly naive one. I had provided the perfect, quiet environment for a predator like Mark to thrive. Mark was my direct manager, a man who seemed to be assembled from a kit of corporate clichés. He wore expensive suits that were always just a little too shiny. His ties were always a shade too loud, and he had a handshake that felt less like a greeting and more like a challenge. He was a master of the corporate dialect, fluent in synergy, optimization, and leveraging assets. To the executives on the 40th floor, he was a charismatic visionary, a man who could distill complex problems into confident, digestible sound bites. To those of us on the 15th floor, the ones who actually did the work, he was a ghost. He would glide through the department, offering vague, unhelpful suggestions before retreating to his office for a series of important calls. He produced nothing, yet he was responsible for everything. He was a black hole for credit, and the gravitational pull of his ambition was immense. Looking back, the warning signs were not just there, they were practically billboards on the side of the highway, and I had been driving right past them with the radio on too loud. The pattern of appropriation started small, insidiously so. I remember a team meeting about a year ago where I proposed a minor but clever tweak to our data processing workflow. It would save the team about 5 hours of manual work a week. It wasn't a groundbreaking idea, but it was mine. Mark listened, nodding thoughtfully, and said, "Interesting, let me chew on that." The very next day, in the larger departmental meeting, he announced that he'd had a moment of inspiration over the weekend and presented my idea, slightly reworded, as his own. I was sitting right there. I felt a flush of confusion and indignation, but I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't a big enough deal to cause a scene over. It was for the good of the team, after all. Then came the reports. I'd spent a month compiling a quarterly analysis, writing every word, designing every chart. I would send it to him for a final review, and when the report was distributed to the executive team, his name would be listed first. When I finally got the courage to ask him about it, he draped an arm over my shoulder in a falsely paternalistic way. "It's a team effort," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "But it's important for leadership to be the face of the department's successes. It shows strength." I accepted his explanation because it was easier than arguing. I rationalized it as just another strange quirk of the corporate ladder, another meaningless political game. I thought that as long as my work was getting out there and making an impact, the name on the cover page didn't matter as much as the content within. This was his genius. He made his theft seem like a necessary part of the corporate process, and my silence seem like a mature, team-oriented attitude. He was a master manipulator, framing my desire for recognition as a selfish impulse that went against the collective good. He built my cage and convinced me the bars were for my own protection, and so, with each small transgression I let slide, the bars got thicker. With every idea he rephrased, every report he rebranded, I was conditioning him. I was teaching him that I would not fight back. I was, in my own passive way, giving him permission to take more. Project Nightingale wasn't his first robbery. It was simply the culmination of his training. It was the grand heist he had been preparing for all along, and I, the diligent, quiet worker, had unknowingly helped him plan it. The culmination of all those small thefts, all those ignored warning signs, began a week before the presentation. Project Nightingale was finally complete. The data was synthesized, the models were tested, and the 90-page report was polished to a brilliant shine. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, the kind of deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from pouring your soul into your work and seeing it become something whole and powerful. The presentation deck was a work of art in its own right, each slide crafted to tell a compelling story, to lead the executive team on a journey that ended with the undeniable conclusion that my strategy was the future of the company. I was proud, and I was ready. Or so I thought. Mark appeared at my desk late one afternoon, a casual lean against my cubicle wall. He didn't ask for a formal meeting. His approach was deliberately relaxed, designed to disarm. "Hey," he started, a friendly smile on his face. "Just got off a call with the 40th floor. They're getting nervous about the presentation. You know how they are." He rolled his eyes, a gesture meant to create a sense of us against the world camaraderie. "They want a director-level pre-briefing. just to make sure all the political boxes are checked before we go to the big show with Abernathy. He explained that he needed to handle the politics for me. He framed it as an act of protection. He painted a picture of the executive suite as a viper pit, a place where a brilliant analyst like me could get torn apart, but where a seasoned manager like him could navigate the treacherous currents. To do that, he said, he needed all the final files, the report, the raw data, the presentation deck, everything. He needed to internalize it, to learn it inside and out so he could defend it against any challenges. He made it sound like a favor, like he was stepping in front of me to take the bullets. A small, cold knot of suspicion tightened in my gut. It was the same feeling I'd had when he'd rephrased my ideas in meetings, but this time it was stronger, more insistent. I must have hesitated because he leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to a confidential whisper. He looked me directly in the eye, his expression a perfect mask of sincerity. "Don't worry," he said, and the words were a balm on my frayed nerves. "I'll make sure you get full credit. This is your work. When we get in front of the CEO, we'll present the final version together, side by side." I wanted to believe him, desperately. I was exhausted from 6 months of relentless work, and the idea of him running interference, of handling the political battles while I focused on the substance, was incredibly appealing. So I pushed that cold knot of suspicion down. I told myself I was being paranoid. I rationalized that this was how things worked at this level. I made a choice. I chose to trust him one last time. I compiled all the files into a single folder, uploaded it to his personal drive, and sent him the link. "Everything's there," I wrote. "Let me know what you need from me to prep for our presentation." He never replied. The truth came the day before the meeting. A notification popped up on my screen, a company-wide calendar reminder for the Project Nightingale strategic proposal. I opened it, my heart starting to beat a little faster, and there it was, in the stark, unforgiving black and white of the attendee list. Organizer, Mark Renshaw. Presenter, Mark Renshaw. My name was not on the list, not as a co-presenter, not even as an attendee. It was as if I had never existed. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked straight to his office, my phone clutched in my hand with the invite displayed on the screen. I didn't knock. He looked up from his computer, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes that was quickly replaced by a calm, practiced smile. I held up the phone. "Mark," I said, my voice tight but even. "I saw the invite. My name isn't on it." He didn't even flinch. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the picture of nonchalance. That," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it, it's just a minor admin error. The CEO's assistant set it up and she probably just forgot to add you, it's no big deal." He could see the disbelief on my face, so he doubled down, his voice taking on a slightly condescending tone. "Look, don't get worked up over nothing. The important thing is the project. Just trust me. I've got this." I stood there, speechless. The lie was so blatant, so insulting in its simplicity. An admin error. He was treating me like an idiot. He was counting on my history of non-confrontation to carry him through. As I walked back to my desk, his final words echoed in my ears. He had told me not to worry. He had told me to trust him. But what I heard, what I finally understood with chilling clarity, was that the line had been crossed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a coup. And I was the deposed, unsuspecting leader, watching the gates of my own kingdom being locked from the inside. The next day felt unreal. I walked into the office under a shroud of dread, the air thick with an anticipation that felt both celebratory and, for me, deeply funereal. The live stream of the presentation was the only thing anyone was talking about. I sat at my desk, logged in, and did the only thing I could do. I watched. I watched Mark stride to the podium. I watched him smile at the CEO, and I watched him present my life's work as his own. He was flawless, I had to give him that. He had studied my notes, memorized my key phrases, and delivered the information with a passion that was utterly convincing. At one point he paused, a thoughtful expression on his face, and told the room, "Project Nightingale became a real passion project for me these last few months." The lie was so audacious, so complete, that I almost gasped. He wasn't just taking the credit, he was inventing an entire emotional history to go along with it, a backstory in which he was the dedicated, sleepless visionary. The praise from the CEO, Mr. Abernathy, was effusive. Through my headphones I heard him call the project a masterclass in strategic thinking, and laud Mark's unparalleled leadership. And just like that, the official narrative was set in stone. The meeting ended, and a ripple of excitement spread through the office. But the worst was yet to come. An hour later, an email notification chimed on my computer. The subject line seared itself into my memory. A huge congratulations to Mark Renshaw on Project Nightingale. It was from Mr. Abernathy himself, sent to the entire company. My hands trembled as I opened it. The email was a glowing testament to Mark's supposed brilliance. It praised his innovative mind, his dedication, and his value to the company. I scanned the text, my heart pounding, desperately searching for a mention of my name, an acknowledgement of my team, even a vague reference to the analysts who supported the project. There was nothing. I was a ghost. Then I read the final paragraph, and the cold dread in my stomach turned into a hot, sickening rage. Mr. Abernathy was not only awarding Mark a substantial financial bonus for the project, but he was also fast-tracking his promotion to senior director. He had not only stolen my work, he was being handsomely rewarded for the theft. The email was a public coronation, and I was the invisible peasant who had built the throne. I couldn't let it stand. The injustice was too immense, too public. I waited until the flurry of congratulations around his desk died down, and I saw him walk into his office, a triumphant smirk on his face. I stood up, walked over, and closed the glass door behind me, the soft click echoing in the sudden quiet. He looked up, his smile fading slightly at my serious expression. "What is it?" he asked, his tone still buoyed by his recent victory. I held my phone up, the CEO's email displayed on the screen. "I saw the announcement, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "A promotion and a bonus. Congratulations." He leaned back, sensing the confrontation. This is where he went on the offensive. "Thank you," he said coolly. "The team really pulled together on this one." "The team?" I countered, my voice low. "My name isn't in that email, Mark. My name isn't anywhere. You told me we would present together." He sighed, a theatrical, disappointed sound, as if I were a child having a tantrum. He began the gaslighting. "Look," he said, steepling his fingers. "Your contribution to the data-gathering phase was noted, and it was appreciated, but a project of this scale requires more than just data. It requires executive-level vision, a strategic narrative. That's the leadership I brought to the table. I took your raw materials, and I built a cathedral." The arrogance was breathtaking. He was demoting me from architect to brickmaker in his own revisionist history. I stood my ground. "You presented my words, my models, my strategy. That isn't leadership, Mark. That's theft." His eyes narrowed. The false congeniality vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glint. "You need to be very careful right now," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're coming across as bitter and not like a team player. Is that how you want to be seen, as someone who makes waves every time the team succeeds? I'm telling you for your own good, drop it. The company is celebrating a huge win right now. Don't ruin the mood." He was no longer just dismissing me. He was threatening me. He was making it clear that if I chose to fight for the truth, he would paint me as a disgruntled, jealous subordinate, and he would use his newfound favor with the CEO to destroy my career. I left his office not with tears in my eyes, but with ice in my veins. He had just confirmed that he wouldn't just let me be invisible, he would actively crush me if I tried to be seen. The day after my confrontation with Mark was one of the longest and most isolating of my professional life. The air in the office had changed. The celebratory buzz was still there, but now it felt directed, exclusive, and I was on the outside of it. People who had once been friendly work acquaintances now avoided my gaze, offering tight, polite smiles if our eyes happened to meet. I could feel the invisible perimeter of speculation and gossip being drawn around my desk. I was no longer just a senior analyst. I was a problem, a loose thread in the company's triumphant new narrative. Mark, meanwhile, was holding court. He walked the floor like a conquering hero, accepting congratulations, laughing loudly, and making a great show of his newfound executive status. He made a point of excluding me from conversations, of turning his back when I approached the coffee machine. He was reinforcing my exile, making it clear to everyone that I was no longer part of his inner circle, that I was now a persona non grata. I ate lunch alone at my desk, the silence of my cubicle a stark contrast to the cheerful chatter I could hear from the break room. I felt a profound sense of humiliation, the kind that makes you feel small and transparent at the same time. I thought the passive-aggressive isolation was the worst of it, but I was wrong. The true breaking point, the moment that transformed my despair into a diamond-hard resolve, came in the form of a quiet conversation late that afternoon. His name was Sam, a junior analyst who I had mentored a bit. He was bright, earnest, and still had that wide-eyed belief in fairness that the corporate world hadn't yet managed to extinguish. He had helped me on the periphery of Project Nightingale, running some of the initial data queries for me, so he knew better than most how deeply I had been involved. He approached my desk when the surrounding area was empty, his expression a mixture of sympathy and nervousness. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking in a low voice. "Hey," he started, wringing his hands slightly. "I'm really sorry about, what happened." I gave him a weak, appreciative smile. "Thanks, Sam. It is what it is." He shook his head, looking genuinely troubled. "No, it's not," he said. "And there's something else you should know." He took a deep breath. "Mark held a debriefing meeting this morning with all the junior staff. You weren't invited. He told us how he wanted to clarify the roles on the project to ensure we all understood how a successful initiative is run." I felt a familiar cold knot forming in my stomach. "And what did he say?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. Sam looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. "He praised you," he said, but the words sounded like a warning. "He said you were a huge help. He called you a real workhorse and said you were fantastic with the spreadsheets. Then he told everyone that your official role had been to assist with the primary data entry." Data entry. The words hung in the air between us, utterly toxic. It was the most dismissing label you could give to an analyst. It was a complete and total erasure of my 6 months of strategic planning, modeling, and intellectual creation. A workhorse. Someone who pulls the cart but has no idea where it's going. This was the final unforgivable blow. This wasn't just a passive defense of his lie anymore. This was an active, premeditated smear campaign. A cold clarity washed over me as I connected the pieces. Stealing the project was step 1. Gaslighting and threatening me when I confronted him was step 2. This was step 3. Proactively poisoning my reputation to anyone who would listen. He was building a firewall of lies around himself, ensuring that if I ever went to HR or tried to tell my story, I would be discredited before I even opened my mouth. Who would believe the data entry girl when she claimed to be the architect of the company's biggest new strategy? He was trying to make me seem insignificant, delusional. In that moment, something inside me broke, or perhaps it was finally forged into something unbreakable. The hurt, the fear, the humiliation, they were all still there, but they were compressed by the sheer force of his malice into a single point of cold, clear purpose. I was done being quiet. I was done playing by the rules of a game that was rigged against me. My desire not to make waves had been the very thing that allowed this tidal wave to form. He had left me with no alternative. This was no longer about reclaiming credit. This was a fight for my professional survival and for the simple, fundamental truth. I looked at Sam and gave him a small, genuine nod. "Thank you for telling me, Sam," I said, my voice steady for the first time all day. "You have no idea how much I appreciate your honesty." As he walked away, I turned back to my monitor, but I wasn't seeing the spreadsheet in front of me. I was seeing a battlefield, and I was finally ready to choose my weapon. The battlefield I saw in my mind was not one of loud, open warfare. After my conversation with Sam, I understood with absolute clarity that a direct assault was doomed to fail. Going to human resources would be my word, the word of a disgruntled data entry girl, against that of a newly promoted CEO-praised senior director. It would devolve into a messy, protracted investigation that would, at best, end inconclusively, and at worst, result in my termination for causing dissent. Mark had already inoculated the company against my version of the truth. I needed a different kind of weapon, something that wasn't an accusation but a confession, something that wasn't my word but irrefutable proof. The office slowly emptied around me, the cheerful good nights of my colleagues feeling distant and foreign. I stayed late, not to work, but to think. Under the guise of organizing my files, I began the somber task of archiving Project Nightingale. It felt like a final act of surrender, moving the folders from my personal drive to the shared network. Each dragon drop was a small pang of grief for the work that was no longer mine. I opened the main project folder and saw the ecosystem of my last 6 months. The raw data sets, the drafts, the brainstorming notes, the endless versions of the presentation deck. It was a digital archaeological record of my effort, a story told in file names and modification dates. And it was in that digital graveyard that the ghost of a memory appeared. I was staring at a file named Q3_financials_urgent SMEG when the memory hit me with the force of a physical impact. It was from about a month ago, during a particularly chaotic deadline. Mark had been on the phone with the vice president, pacing frantically by his desk while trying to pull up a spreadsheet on his laptop. For whatever reason, his login wasn't working. He was getting flustered, his voice growing louder and more irritated as he spoke into his headset, promising the VP he'd have the numbers in just 1 second. He kept jabbing at his keyboard with his index finger, his face turning red. Finally, in a spectacular display of arrogant impatience, he looked up, saw me at my desk, and barked across the 2 rows of cubicles that separated us. "You! I can't get in. Log into my machine and email me the Q3 financials right now," he had snapped, not even bothering to use my name. I had stared back, confused. I couldn't log into his machine without his password. He saw my hesitation, and with an exasperated sigh loud enough for the whole department to hear, he shouted his password. "It's Company Lover 103, capital CL number 123! Exclamation point. For crying out loud, just get it done." At the time, I was mortified by the unprofessionalism and flustered by the urgent demand. I had quickly logged in, sent him the file, logged out, and tried to erase the incident from my mind. The password itself was so perfectly him, transparently sycophantic, utterly uncreative, and dangerously simple. But now, sitting in the quiet twilight of the office, the memory returned not as an embarrassment, but as a divine revelation. I stopped what I was doing, my hand hovering over my mouse. A slow smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile I'd had in days. His greatest flaws, his laziness, his arrogance, his utter carelessness were not just character defects. They were a security vulnerability. A man like Mark, who saw himself as untouchable and viewed basic operational security as a tedious chore for the little people, would never, ever bother to change his password. He had, in a moment of pure hubris, handed me the keys to his kingdom. The plan began to assemble itself in my mind, piece by perfect piece. I wouldn't need to go to HR. I wouldn't need to plead my case to anyone. I wouldn't have to be the accuser. Mark himself would be the one to tell the truth. I would use his own email account, his own digital identity, to distribute the one thing he couldn't gaslight or spin: the evidence. The project files weren't just documents. They were a forensic record. The metadata on every file listed me as the original author. The version history showed hundreds of saves over thousands of hours, all under my username. The files were a diary of my work, and he had been too ignorant or too arrogant to even think of wiping them clean. The feeling that washed over me was not one of vengeful glee, but of immense, calming power. The despair and helplessness that had plagued me for days evaporated, replaced by the cool, sharp focus of a strategist on the verge of a checkmate. I was no longer a victim in his story. I was the author of his. I carefully finished archiving the files, closed my computer, and packed my bag. As I walked out of the silent office and into the cool night air, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to win. The next day I came to work a different person. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, humming intensity. I was a vessel for a single clear purpose. I went about my morning routine with a deliberate calm, answering emails, sipping my coffee, and nodding to colleagues. I observed Mark from a distance. He was in his element, reveling in his newfound glory. He took a 2-hour lunch, spent most of the afternoon laughing on the phone, and left promptly at 4:45 p.m., announcing to anyone who would listen that he was heading off to a celebratory dinner. His arrogance was my accomplice, and his laziness was my timetable. My plan was precise, and timing was everything. I couldn't send the email in the middle of the workday. It would get lost in the noise, and he would have time to run damage control. I needed to wait until the moment of maximum impact. 5 o'clock was the end of the official day, but it was the golden hour for corporate drama. It was the time when people were winding down, taking one last look at their inbox before heading home. An email sent at 5:01 p.m. on a Wednesday had an air of late-breaking, important news, and I knew Mark, a creature of habit and leisure, would be long gone, blissfully unaware as his world was dismantled. The clock on my computer ticked over to 5:01 p.m. A quiet exodus began around me as people packed their bags. This was it. A strange calm settled over me. This was no longer an act of anger. It was a necessary and logical conclusion. It was the final line of code in a program I had been writing in my mind all night. I stood up and walked the 20 paces to Mark's desk. His chair was empty, a half-empty mug of coffee sitting next to his keyboard. I sat down, the leather of his ridiculously expensive chair still warm. My heart was a steady, heavy drum in my chest, but my hands were perfectly still as I woke his computer from sleep. The login screen appeared, asking for his password. I took a deep breath and typed in the monument to his own arrogance, COMPANYOVER123. For a fraction of a second, I felt a flicker of doubt. What if he'd changed it? What if this was all for nothing? Then the screen flickered and his desktop appeared. A garish, self-congratulatory photo of him on a golf course. I was in. My fingers moved with practiced efficiency. I opened his email client, the inbox filled with fawning messages of congratulations. I found the original email from the CEO, the one that had been my death sentence and his coronation. I clicked on it, then hit the Reply All button. The recipient list populated, a vast scroll of names that included every single executive, every department head, and every employee at our corporate headquarters. This wasn't a whisper, it was a broadcast to the entire kingdom. I began to type, composing the message I had rehearsed in my head 100 times. The tone had to be perfect, not vengeful, not angry, but humble and corrective. It had to sound like Mark, a man so caught up in his own success that he had made a terrible, embarrassing mistake and was now, as a man of supposed integrity, trying to fix it. Subject: a huge congratulations to Mark Renshaw on Project Nightingale. Team, I wrote, I am writing this because I am overwhelmed by the incredibly kind words and praise I've received for the success of Project Nightingale. However, in the excitement of the presentation, I committed a serious and inexcusable oversight. While I was the presenter for the project, the credit for its creation and success does not belong to me. The real architect, the person who spent 6 months developing the strategy, building the models, and designing the presentation from the ground up, is my role, was simply to shepherd her brilliant work through the final stages. To ensure full transparency and to make sure the proper credit is given, I have attached the original project files, which include the complete version history and metadata, for your review. My sincerest apologies to both my name and to the company for this misrepresentation. Sincerely, Mark Renshaw. The message was a masterpiece of corporate self-flagellation. Now for the evidence. I attached the 3 files I had prepared. The first was the original proposal, showing my name as the author and a creation date from 6 months prior. The second was the final presentation deck itself, the very one he had used, its file properties a damning indictment. The final attachment was a simple PDF I had created, a document containing clear screenshots of the metadata for every key file, with my name and the hundreds of hours of work highlighted in red. It was a clean, undeniable, and devastating portfolio of evidence. My cursor hovered over the Send button. This was the point of no return. One click, and everything would change. There was no fear, only a sense of profound finality. I clicked the button. The email vanished from the outbox. It was done. I logged out of his computer, walked back to my desk, gathered my belongings, and headed for the elevator, not looking back. As I stepped out of the building into the evening air, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a quiet, steely sense of justice. The bomb had been planted. Now I just had to wait for the explosion. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't the fitful, anxious sleeplessness of the past week, but a state of heightened, adrenalized awareness. I felt like an actor on an opening night, waiting for the curtain to rise. When I walked into the office the next morning, I could feel it immediately. The bomb had not just gone off. It had vaporized the normal, placid atmosphere of the office and replaced it with something tense and electric. The usual morning hum of productivity was gone, replaced by small, hushed clusters of people speaking in low voices. As I walked to my desk, the conversations would stop, and I could feel dozens of eyes on my back. They weren't looks of pity anymore. They were looks of awe, curiosity, and a little bit of fear. Overnight, I had transformed from a ghost into a lightning rod. My strategy for the day was simple: say nothing, do my work, and let the story tell itself. I sat down, logged into my computer, and opened a spreadsheet that needed updating. I arranged my face into a mask of calm professionalism, becoming an island of tranquility in the middle of a roiling sea of gossip. Inside, my heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. But on the outside, I was perfectly still. I knew that my composure was, in itself, a powerful statement. It projected a confidence that unnerved those who expected me to be emotional or defensive. The main act began at precisely 9:30 a.m. The doors to the office flew open with enough force to make them bang against the stoppers, and Mark stormed in. He was a complete mess. The man, who was always impeccably tailored, looked like he had slept in his car. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. His face was a sickly pale color, except for 2 angry patches of red on his cheeks. Susan's absence. I knew what he did for the table, to serve everybody else's. He looked haunted, a man who had spent the entire night being bombarded by calls, texts, and emails, each one a nail in his professional coffin. He stopped in the middle of the department, his frantic eyes scanning the room until they locked onto mine. For a long, silent moment, the entire office held its collective breath. I slowly looked up from my monitor, my expression neutral, and met his gaze. The look in his eyes was everything I had expected and more. There was a wild, cornered animal rage, a fury so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air between us. But underneath it, I saw something else: pure, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a predator who simply could not comprehend how the sheep had managed to grow wolves' teeth. He took a half-step towards my desk, his mouth forming a snarl. I could see the accusation, the torrent of vitriol he wanted to unleash, gathering behind his teeth. But then he stopped. He looked around and saw what I saw, that every single employee was frozen, watching this silent drama unfold. He realized that any outburst, any public accusation, would be an immediate confession of guilt. His audience, the very people he had spent years trying to impress, had become his jury. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and the silence was his warden. Just as the tension became unbearable, a sharp, clinical voice cut through the quiet. "Mark." We all turned. It was Carol, the CEO's executive assistant, a woman with a reputation for iron-willed efficiency and zero tolerance for nonsense. She stood at the entrance to our department, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Abernathy's office, now," she said, her voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. "And bring your laptop." The entire department watched as Mark, deflated and defeated, turned without another glance at me. He walked to his desk on unsteady legs, unplugged his laptop, and began the long walk of shame towards the executive elevators. Carol followed a few paces behind him, a silent executioner leading the condemned to the gallows. The meeting took place in the main glass-walled conference room, putting the drama on full display, if not in full audio. For the next hour and a half, work ceased to exist on the 15th floor. We all pretended to type, but our eyes were glued to the silent pantomime unfolding above us. We could see Mark gesturing wildly, then slumping in his chair. We could see Mr. Abernathy, his face like stone, and the head of HR looking down at a stack of papers I knew were printouts of my evidence. It was an agonizing, drawn-out purgatory. My plan had worked perfectly up to this point, but as the minutes ticked by, a sliver of doubt crept in. Could he somehow talk his way out of this? Was his skill at manipulation powerful enough to overcome the hard, cold facts? The door to the conference room remained closed, and with it the final verdict on my future. The 90 minutes that Mark was in that conference room felt longer than the 6 months I had spent on the project. The entire department was locked in a state of suspended animation, the silence punctuated only by the occasional, self-conscious cough. Then, finally, we heard the soft click of the conference room door opening. Every head on the 15th floor snapped up. The show was over, and the verdict was in. Mark emerged first. He was a man hollowed out, a walking shell of the arrogant executive who had stormed in that morning. The rage was gone, the panic was gone, all of it burned away and replaced by a deep, vacant exhaustion. His face was slack, his shoulders slumped forward in a permanent cringe of defeat. He looked like he had aged 10 years in that room. He shuffled forward, his eyes fixed on the gray carpeting in front of him, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at anyone. He was a king who had been stripped of his robes, his crown, and his dignity, left with nothing but the crushing weight of his own failure. Following a few steps behind him was the head of HR, a woman named Miss Albright, her expression grim and professional. She didn't speak, but her presence was a clear and powerful statement. This was a supervised exit. She escorted Mark to his desk, the entire department watching in dead silence. There was no dramatic rage, no throwing of items. The reality was quieter and somehow far more pathetic. We watched as he slowly, methodically packed his personal effects into a small brown cardboard box. A cheap mug with his alma mater's logo, a framed picture of a family that would now have to hear his story of disgrace, a meaningless glass trophy for Salesman of the Quarter from 5 years ago. Each item he placed in the box seemed to chip away another piece of his carefully constructed facade, revealing the unremarkable, dishonest man underneath. When the box was full, he tucked it under one arm and began his final walk of shame toward the exit. It was at that precise moment that the second act of the payoff began. The CEO, Mr. Abernathy, stepped out from the conference room. He was a tall, imposing man, and his expression was one of cold, controlled fury. For a second, he just stood there, his gaze sweeping across the silent department. Then he started walking. He didn't head for the elevators. He walked past the whispering clusters of employees, past the rows of cubicles, on a direct and unmistakable path straight to my desk. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between us. I stood up, my legs feeling a little shaky. Mark, who was now only a few feet from the exit, had stopped. He couldn't help himself. He had to watch. He had to witness this final, brutal reversal of fortune. Mr. Abernathy stopped in front of me, his expression softening slightly as he looked at me. In a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the silent room, he spoke. "My name," he began, and the simple act of him saying my name felt like a momentous occasion. "On behalf of the entire executive team, and from me personally, I want to offer you my sincerest apologies. I was shown the complete file history this morning. The evidence is clear and undeniable. What was done to you was a profound failure of leadership and a complete betrayal of the values of this company." He paused, and his eyes flickered for a second towards the exit where Mark stood frozen. He then looked back at me. "What you created with Project Nightingale was not just a good piece of work. It was a phenomenal piece of work. It is, without a doubt, one of the most brilliant strategic proposals I have seen in my entire career." He extended his hand. "I would be honored if you would join me for lunch tomorrow. I want to discuss your future here because after today it is very clear that you are the kind of leader this company actually needs." I shook his hand, my voice barely a whisper as I said, "Thank you, sir, I'd like that." I don't know if Mark made a sound as he finally turned and pushed through the glass doors for the last time. I wasn't looking at him anymore. No one was. All the power, all the attention, all the respect in the room had shifted. It had moved from the thief to the creator. As Mr. Abernathy walked away, a few of my colleagues started a quiet, hesitant applause, which then grew stronger. It was a sound of relief, of a moral balance being restored. I sat back down at my desk, no longer a ghost, no longer a victim, but the architect of my own hard-won vindication. The applause that followed Mr. Abernathy's declaration was the final note in a symphony of justice that had played out for all to see. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what happened settled into the foundations of the company, becoming something of a corporate legend. The aftershocks of that single email I sent from Mark's desk continued to ripple outwards, fundamentally and permanently altering the landscape of my career and what was left of his. Mark, as I later learned through official channels, was terminated for cause. The official reasons cited were gross misconduct and a breach of the company's intellectual property and ethics policies. The evidence was so overwhelming that he had no room to negotiate. There was no generous severance package, no quiet agreement to let him resign gracefully. He was simply and surgically removed. Our industry, for all its global reach, is a surprisingly small and tightly knit community, and news travels with breathtaking speed. the story of a director being fired for stealing a subordinate's work in such a brazen and provable way became a hot topic of gossip. Mark's reputation was not just damaged, it was irrevocably destroyed. He became a cautionary tale, a shorthand for the ultimate professional sin. He was blacklisted, not by an official decree, but by the quiet, collective judgment of an industry that, for all its faults, does not tolerate being so publicly and foolishly deceived. My lunch with Mr. Abernathy the next day was a turning point. He was candid, admitting how thoroughly Mark had misled him and how my actions, while unorthodox, had exposed a serious flaw in their leadership evaluation process. True to his word, he formally offered me Mark's old position of senior director, with a salary to match and the full, substantial bonus that had been promised for Project Nightingale. I accepted. Stepping into Mark's old office was a surreal experience. I had the ridiculously expensive leather chair replaced with my old, comfortable one from my cubicle, a small, symbolic act of cleansing. I was determined to lead with the integrity that he so profoundly lacked. One of my first acts was to call Sam, the junior analyst who had warned me, into my new office. I thanked him for his courage and made sure he was assigned to the next high-profile project, giving him the chance to shine that I had been denied. My own reputation within the company was solidified in a way I could never have achieved with just hard work alone. I was no longer the quiet, digital coup, became known as someone with a brilliant strategic mind, but also as someone with an unbreakable will and a core of steel. My colleagues treated me with a new level of respect, one that was tinged with a healthy amount of awe. The story of my quiet, digital coup became known as the Nightingale precedent, a tale told to new hires as both an inspiration and a warning. Do good work, and always give credit where it is due, because the truth has a funny way of finding its own voice. Looking back on it all now, the lesson I learned was deeper than just cheaters never win. I learned that true power doesn't always come from the loudest voice in the room, but often from the quietest, most competent mind. Mark's downfall wasn't just a result of my plan. It was a direct consequence of his own character. His arrogance made him believe he was untouchable. His laziness made him careless, and his dishonesty made him vulnerable. He handed me the weapon, loaded it, and then pointed it at himself. I just had the courage to pull the trigger. In the end, I didn't just reclaim credit for my work. I reclaimed my professional identity, my voice, and my future, proving that a carefully worded email, backed by irrefutable truth, can be more powerful than the loudest lie.